The cameras flashed as smoke poured from the mansion's windows. Everyone screamed for the CEO. No one dared to go in. No one, except the man she'd humiliated that very morning. A single dad, covered in grease and ash, breaking through the flames with nothing but a soaked jacket and a promise, "No one burns alone tonight." What happened next didn't just save her life. It changed both of theirs forever. If stories like this remind you that kindness can rise even from the ashes, stay with us. And don't forget to share this moment of courage and redemption. The lobby of Harrington Industries gleamed like a mirror. Chrome, glass, and silence sharp enough to cut. Ethan Cole paused before the receptionist's desk, his reflection fragmented across the marble floor. The smell of engine oil still clung to his hands no matter how hard he'd scrubbed. He smoothed the creases from his second-hand shirt, straightened his tie, and whispered under his breath, "For Lily. Just get through this for Lily." The receptionist looked up, scanning him from the worn soles of his boots to the smudge of grease on his cuff. "Maintenance position?" she asked flatly. He nodded. "8th floor. But hurry. The CEO doesn't wait." Victoria Harrington was waiting indeed. The room he entered was all glass walls and polished chrome, a view of the city stretching behind her like a kingdom. She didn't rise when he walked in. "Mr. Cole, is it?" Her voice was cool, precise. "You were once a senior engineer at Aerodyne?" Ethan nodded, clutching his folder. "Yes, ma'am. I left after—" He hesitated. "After an accident. My wife—" "We've read the file," she cut in, not unkindly, just efficiently. "And since then, you've worked at a garage?" Her manicured hand flipped through his resume, pausing at a coffee stain. "We don't often see candidates who bring the smell of motor oil to a corporate interview." A chuckle rippled from the junior managers seated nearby. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could almost hear his late wife's voice in his head. "Stay kind, even when they don't deserve it." He took a breath. "I fix things, ma'am. That's what I do best. Doesn't matter if it's an engine or an air conditioner. It just has to work." Victoria arched an eyebrow. "We have people for that. Our machines are a little more sophisticated than a garage car lift." The laughter grew louder this time, and something inside Ethan snapped but didn't break. He stood a little taller. "With respect, ma'am, the principles don't change. Machines fail when people stop listening to them." For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Hers, icy and curious. His, calm but wounded. Then she looked back down. "Noted. You'll hear from HR if we decide to proceed." The dismissal was swift, polite, final. Outside the conference room, Ethan's shoulders sagged. The glass doors closed behind him, muting the sound of laughter. He reached into his wallet for the bus ticket home, but his fingers brushed something else. A worn photograph of his wife, Emily, her smile gentle, her hand resting on the shoulder of their little girl, scrawled on the back in her handwriting, "Always stay kind, no matter how they treat you." He stepped out into the city air, the afternoon sun glaring against the skyscrapers. Around him, people moved quickly, phones to their ears, heels clicking, lives so far removed from his own. He walked to the bus stop, feeling the weight of rejection settle like dust on his chest. At the corner of the street, a security guard who'd seen him earlier called out, "Tough day, son?" Ethan offered a tired smile. "You could say that." The man nodded, lighting a cigarette. "Funny thing about pride," he said, exhaling smoke into the wind. "It burns before it teaches." Ethan didn't reply. He just looked up at the towering glass building, where his reflection shimmered faintly in the mirrored panels. Small, tired, invisible. Then he turned away, his mind already on Lily. She'd be waiting at home, drawing pictures of airplanes like always, asking if he'd found a job. He rehearsed his answer in silence. "Not yet, sweetheart. But soon." As he boarded the bus, the hum of the engine filled the quiet. Steady, reliable, a language he still understood. Through the window, The city blurred into streaks of gold and shadow. Somewhere up there, the woman who'd mocked him was probably back to her world of glass and power. But he couldn't shake the strange look that had flickered across her face. Something almost human, almost regretful, before the door had closed. He didn't know it yet, but that brief, burning humiliation would become the first spark of something far greater. In time, the same fire that seared his pride would test the limits of his compassion and reveal just how much strength could hide behind the hands of a single dad who still believed in kindness. The rain had stopped by evening, leaving the streets slick with reflections of city lights. Ethan's old pickup rattled as he drove Lily home from her piano lesson. She sat in the passenger seat, humming softly, clutching her worn, stuffed rabbit. "Did they like your song today, sweetheart?" he asked. "Mrs. Clark said I played with more heart this time," Lily said, smiling proudly. "That's my girl," he said, his voice warm despite the fatigue in his eyes. The radio played quietly between them until a breaking news voice cut in. "Fire crews are responding to a massive blaze at the Harrington estate on North Hill Road. Sources confirm CEO Victoria Harrington was inside when the fire broke out." Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. For a moment, pride and anger flickered, the memory of her cold voice, the laughter. Then Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Daddy, shouldn't we help?" The words landed softly but firmly, like his wife's voice used to when reminding him of the man he wanted to be. He pulled the truck to the curb, heart hammering. "You're right. We help if we can." The mansion came into view long before they reached it, a pillar of flame clawing at the night sky. The air reeked of smoke and burning wood. People screamed outside the gates. Security guards shouted into radios, and the first fire truck was still miles away. Ethan jumped out, leaving Lily with a promise. "Stay in the truck. Don't move until I come back." She grabbed his sleeve, terrified. "Dad, please." "I'll be okay," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. He soaked his jacket with water from a garden hose and ran toward the blaze. Inside, the air was thick, the heat punishing. The grand staircase was collapsing in places, fire crawling up the walls like living veins. Ethan wrapped a wet blanket around his shoulders and pressed forward, calling out, "Anyone here? Victoria!" He heard nothing at first, but crackling wood and shattering glass. Then, faintly, a cough, sharp, desperate. He followed the sound through a corridor that glowed orange. He found her near the study, trapped beneath a fallen beam. Her once immaculate suit was torn, her face streaked with soot and terror. "Mr. Cole?" she rasped in disbelief. "What are you No time. Hold still." He grabbed a crowbar from the debris, pried the beam up with a grunt, and pulled her free. She stumbled, disoriented. "I can't." "You can," he said firmly, guiding her arm over his shoulder. "Hold on to me." They moved slowly through the smoke. Every breath felt like fire. The ceiling above them groaned as they reached the main hall. "This way," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. He spotted a heavy curtain, ripped it down, and used it to block falling embers. Outside, through the shattered window, he could see the silhouettes of firefighters approaching. But then a blast of heat hit from behind, an explosion from the gas line. The floor buckled. Ethan shielded her with his body as a burning beam crashed nearby. "Go!" she cried, coughing. "You'll die if you stay." "Not without you," he said, his voice steady. He threw the curtain over her and dragged her through the last stretch, kicking open a side door that gave way with a scream of hinges. The cold night air rushed in, merciful and sharp. They stumbled onto the lawn just as the roof collapsed behind them in a roar of flame. Victoria collapsed to her knees, shaking violently. The world spun around her, sirens, shouts, lights. She looked up at Ethan, silhouetted against the inferno, his face blackened with soot, his eyes searching the flames as if looking for someone else. And then, faintly, she heard him whisper a name that wasn't hers. Emily. His late wife's name. It came out raw, aching, full of loss. Before she could ask, her vision dimmed, and she slipped into unconsciousness. When she opened her eyes again, she was being lifted onto a stretcher. Firefighters swarmed around. Water hoses hissed, the night alive with chaos. She turned her head just enough to see Ethan kneeling a few feet away, coughing into his hand, paramedics checking his burns. A small voice broke through the noise. Lily's. She was crying, clutching her father's arm. "Daddy, you're okay!" He hugged her with his good arm, his other hand still trembling. Through the haze, Victoria saw something she hadn't seen in years. Pure, selfless love. The man she'd mocked that morning had run into hell for her without hesitation. The world blurred again as oxygen filled her lungs, and the last thing she remembered before darkness took her was the sight of that little girl's arms around her father, framed by the burning glow of her fallen empire. The hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. When Victoria Harrington opened her eyes, she expected the sterile white ceiling and the ache in her ribs. What she didn't expect was the memory that flooded back. The heat, the smoke, and the man who had carried her out of the fire. Ethan Cole. The name burned at the edges of her mind like an echo of shame. The same man she'd humiliated just hours before. Now he had saved her life. She stared at the oxygen tube at her nose, feeling the unfamiliar weight of gratitude mixed with guilt. The nurse entered quietly. "You're lucky, Ms. Harrington. If he hadn't gone in when he did." She didn't finish. Victoria's fingers clenched around the blanket. "He's here?" The nurse nodded. "Downstairs, being treated for burns. He refused to leave until he knew you were safe." 2 days later, Victoria found herself standing outside a small room in the recovery ward. Through the glass, she saw Ethan sitting beside a sleeping little girl, the same one she'd seen at the fire. Lily's hand rested in her father's. Ethan's forearm was wrapped in gauze, his hair still singed at the edges, but there was peace on his face, a quiet strength she hadn't noticed before. She watched as he adjusted the blanket around his daughter, then brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Something in her chest tightened. When she finally gathered the courage to knock, Ethan looked up. Surprise flickered across his tired eyes, but he stood, polite as ever. "Ms. Harrington," he said softly, "you shouldn't be walking yet." She ignored the comment and glanced at Lily. "Is she all right?" "Just smoke inhalation," he said. "She's tougher than she looks." The faintest smile crossed his face. Victoria's voice faltered. "I wanted to thank you for what you did." "You didn't have to." Ethan shook his head. "I couldn't have lived with myself if I didn't try." Her gaze drifted to the nightstand, where a small leather bracelet lay coiled beside a cup of tea. It was handmade, braided from worn shoelaces, with the words "Dad's Lucky Charm" burned into the side. She touched it gently. "Did she make this?" "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "She says it keeps me safe when I fix things." His tone softened. "Guess it worked." Victoria lingered, searching for words. "The company tried to send you a check, a reward for saving me. You refused it." Ethan shrugged. "Money won't fix what caused that fire. Maybe use it to make sure your employees have better safety systems next time." The words stung, not because they were rude, but because they were right. For years, she had prided herself on efficiency, not empathy. Yet standing here, she saw the cost of that approach reflected in his calm, unyielding decency. The nurse came in, bringing a tray of food for Lily. "She needs to eat when she wakes," she said cheerfully before leaving again. Victoria glanced down at the tray. On the plate sat a small, uneven cookie shaped like a sunflower. "Emily's favorite," Ethan murmured absently before catching himself. "My wife used to bake those." Victoria froze. "Emily." The name from the fire. He looked away, embarrassed. "She passed 3 years ago. I guess some habits don't burn away easily." Without warning, Victoria's breath caught. Her own mother, long gone, Used to bake the same sunflower-shaped cookies every Sunday when she was a child. It had been decades since anyone had mentioned them. She blinked hard, fighting an unexpected tremor in her voice. My mother used to make these too. Ethan looked up then, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a CEO but as a person with her own scars. Maybe she taught Emily's mom, he said quietly. Small world. Lily stirred, opening her eyes. Daddy? She whispered. Ethan leaned down. Hey, sweetheart. She noticed Victoria then and smiled shyly. You're the lady from the fire. Yes, Victoria said softly. Your dad saved me. Lily beamed. He saves everyone. He even fixed my piano when it broke. Victoria smiled faintly. He fixes people too, I think. Over the next few days, she visited again. At first to check on Lily, then simply to talk. She brought a new blanket, a small stuffed bear, and even a few books. Each time she came, Ethan seemed surprised, but not resistant. Their conversations grew longer, about loss, about raising children alone, about trying to find meaning after everything burned down. One afternoon, Victoria sat with Lily at the piano in the hospital's playroom. The child's fingers danced over the keys, hesitant but pure. You're good, Victoria said. I had a teacher once, Lily replied. But Dad fixes the piano so it sounds happy again. That night, Victoria returned home to the charred remains of her mansion. The smell of smoke lingered. In the ruins of her study, she found the twisted metal frame of her piano, the same model as the one Lily played. She stood there in silence, the memory of that small, brave girl and her father echoing in her mind. For the first time in years, Victoria felt the walls she'd built around her heart begin to crack, letting in the faintest glimmer of warmth she thought she'd lost forever. Weeks passed, and the blackened shell of Harrington Estate stood like a scar against the skyline. Insurance investigators came and went, their flashlights sweeping through the soot and silence. Victoria had returned to work, but something in her had changed. The office glass walls, once symbols of control, now felt like barriers. The woman who had once mocked a mechanic found herself thinking about him daily. His quiet steadiness, the way he never once asked for praise. And somewhere between those thoughts and her nightly insomnia, a question began to smolder. Why had that fire started at all? Ethan hadn't gone back to his old job. He spent his mornings repairing broken tools in his garage and his afternoons volunteering at a local community center. But one evening, while he was fixing a generator for the center, a man he recognized approached. Tom Keller, an electrician who'd been working part-time at Harrington Industries before the fire. He spoke nervously. You didn't hear this from me, but something was off that night. We got orders to test the backup system hours before the fire started. From Lucas Green himself. Ethan froze. Lucas Green, the CFO of the company, Victoria's longtime right hand. Why would the CFO order something like that? That's what scared me, Tom said, lowering his voice. And now the security footage is gone. That night, Ethan sat in his truck outside the dark remains of the mansion. He watched the flickering caution lights of the barricades, the smell of char still faint in the air. He didn't want to get involved again. But then he thought of Lily's small voice. Daddy, you always fix things. He took a breath and pulled out his old engineering tablet, the one he hadn't touched in years. The next day, he went to Harrington Industries under the pretense of returning some borrowed tools. He passed security easily. The guards still remembered him as the man who saved the boss. In the sub-basement near the generator room, he found what he suspected. Melted wires, scorched residue that didn't match accidental fire patterns. Someone had used accelerants designed to mimic electrical faults. He took photos, careful and discreet. Victoria found him hours later outside her office, covered in dust, eyes intense. Ethan, what are you doing here? Trying to keep you alive, he said simply, handing her the tablet. She frowned, scrolling through the photos. Are you suggesting this was arson? I'm not suggesting, he replied. I'm telling you, someone wanted you gone. Her instinct was to deny it. That's ridiculous. Lucas has been with me for 15 years. But the more she studied the evidence, the more unease crept in. Why would he? Money, Ethan said quietly. Power. The insurance payout alone would make anyone rich. And maybe he thought you were a liability after the last few quarters. Victoria's throat tightened. She remembered Lucas insisting she increase her policy coverage 2 months before the fire. You have to trust me on this, Ethan said. But I need proof. Real proof. He didn't expect what came next. Lily had been waiting quietly in the hallway, holding her small voice recorder, a toy shaped like a star. Dad? She said softly. That man from your company, Mr. Green, he was on the phone at the hospital. He said, the plan almost worked. I pressed record because he looked mean. Ethan's heart stopped. Victoria reached for the recorder with shaking hands, pressed play, and Lucas's voice filled the air. Make sure the evidence stays buried. She'll take the blame, and the board will hand me the chair. Silence followed. The weight of betrayal hung heavy between them. The next morning, Victoria called for an emergency board meeting. The press was already circling, rumors of corporate negligence spreading fast. Lucas entered with his usual smug composure until the projector flickered on. The audio played through the conference room, crystal clear. Gasps erupted around the table. His face went white. Security moved in before he could speak. When it was over, Victoria looked across the room to where Ethan stood at the back, his daughter's hand in his. She walked toward him, her heels echoing in the silence. You saved me twice, she said quietly. Once from the fire, and once from the people I trusted. Ethan gave a small smile. Maybe you just needed to see who was still standing after the smoke cleared. She blinked away tears, whispering, I mocked the wrong man. He shook his head gently. Maybe just the wrong version of yourself. As Lucas was escorted out, the boardroom fell silent again. But this time, there was no glass wall between truth and justice. For the first time in years, Victoria felt free. Not powerful, not untouchable, but free. And standing beside the man who had risked everything with nothing to gain, she understood that real strength didn't come from control. It came from courage, the kind that runs into burning buildings for people who once turned away. 6 months after the boardroom scandal, the city had almost forgotten the fire. But for those who lived it, the ashes still whispered reminders. The Harrington name, once synonymous with steel and ambition, now stood for something gentler. Victoria had stepped down as CEO, leaving the company in new hands and redirecting her wealth towards something more human. A foundation called the Sunflower Project, dedicated to helping families rebuild after loss. She said the idea came from a cookie and a child who'd reminded her what kindness looked like. Ethan stood outside the newly built workshop on the outskirts of the city, the smell of fresh sawdust and motor oil in the air. Above the wide doors hung a simple sign carved by hand, Sunflower Workshop, where kindness rebuilds what fire destroys. He wiped his hands on his jeans and smiled as he watched a group of trainees, former factory workers and single parents, practice welding under the afternoon sun. Lily ran between them, holding a tray of lemonade cups, her laughter filling the air. Looks like you've built yourself quite a kingdom, a familiar voice said. Ethan turned to see Victoria walking up the gravel path. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, a world away from the sharp suits of her old life. The sunlight caught her hair, and for a second he almost didn't recognize her. Not a kingdom, he said with a small grin. Just a place where things and people get fixed. She stepped closer, handing him a folded cloth. Inside was a small brass plate engraved with, "In memory of second chances." For the entrance, she said, I thought it should say what this place really stands for. He looked at her for a long moment, eyes softening. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she interrupted gently. Because you taught me that strength doesn't come from control. It comes from care. They walked together through the workshop. She paused by a workbench where a nearly restored piano stood, its wood polished to a soft shine. You really fixed it, she murmured. The one from my old study. Took some effort, Ethan admitted. But Lily helped, said it needed to sound happy again. Victoria smiled, running her fingers lightly over the keys. Would you play something? He shook his head, stepping aside. It's her turn to play now. As if on cue, Lily approached, her small hands resting on the keys. She began to play the melody Ethan had once written for his late wife, a song called You're Safe Now. The notes floated through the open workshop, blending with the sound of laughter and tools, wrapping everything in a quiet peace. Halfway through the song, Victoria joined in, her voice soft but steady, humming along until her words found shape. It was the first time she'd sung in public since childhood. When the last note faded, there was only silence and the warmth of something unspoken between them. After the workers left for the day, the three of them sat outside on the wooden steps, watching the sunset bleed gold over the fields. Lily rested her head on her father's shoulder, half asleep. Will Miss Victoria come back tomorrow? She mumbled. Ethan glanced at her, then at Victoria, who smiled faintly. Only if your dad lets me help paint the next room. Then she has to, Lily murmured before drifting off. For a while, neither adult spoke. The air smelled of pine and rain. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. You know, after the fire, I kept trying to rebuild what I lost, but I think maybe it was supposed to burn. The house, the company, the old me. Maybe it had to, so something new could grow. Ethan nodded slowly. Sometimes the fire doesn't destroy, it refines. She turned to him. And you, Ethan Cole, you fixed more than a machine. You fixed a person who forgot how to feel. He smiled, looking out at the horizon. Guess that's what mechanics do best. He reached into his pocket and handed her something small. A leather bracelet, nearly identical to his own. Lily wanted you to have this. Says everyone who helps rebuild deserves one. Victoria's breath caught as she traced the words burned into it. Dad's lucky charm, family edition. She slipped it onto her wrist, her eyes glistening. Tell her I'll wear it every day. Ethan looked down at his daughter and then back at her. She'll see it herself. We're not going anywhere. As the last light of day dipped behind the hills, Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. No promises were spoken, no declarations made. Just the quiet certainty that some fires don't end in ruin. They reveal what's worth saving. In the distance, the workshop lights flickered on, illuminating the brass plate at the entrance. In memory of second chances, beneath it, someone had added a line in careful script. Because kindness can rebuild what pride once destroyed. And in that glow, between the hum of cicadas, the scent of wood and warmth, and the steady breathing of a child asleep, two souls who had once met in fire finally found their peace. Sometimes the fire that destroys isn't meant to punish. It's meant to reveal what's worth saving. In the end, it wasn't power or pride that rebuilt their lives, but compassion, courage, and the quiet love of a little girl who believed her dad could fix anything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And remember, kindness can rebuild what pride once burned.